From the outside, Darius and Lena appeared to have it all: a thriving company, a lovely house, and a happy marriage. Tech entrepreneur Darius had created a thriving startup handling AI-powered financial services. Lena, an interior designer, matched her husband's meticulousness with her great eye for detail. Their social media profiles were full of happy messages, well chosen to capture their ideal life. Benevolent darkness, though, was rotting beneath this front. Lena had always sensed in her relationship with Darius a discrepancy that she could not quite identify. She had seen minor changes in his behavior last year. He worked longer hours at his job, went to conferences far away without her, and started to be quite secretive about his phone. "Friends, sorry to interrupt, but please help me reach 2,000 subscribers by the end of the summer. Let's keep going." Lena's mounting discomfort drove her to act in a way she never would have imagined herself able to, poring over his phone. She silently unlocked Darius's device one night when he nodded off. Her fingers shook as she tapped on the messaging app. And there it was, a long thread of exchanges with a woman called Kala. The messages were personal, full of love confessions and dreams of a future together, not business-related. Lena needed this last bit of proof to validate what her instincts had been murmuring all along. Darius was having a relationship outside of marriage. The knowledge that Karima, her mother-in-law, was actively supporting the affair stunned her more than the affair itself. Many references to Karima, urging her son to keep his secret relationship quiet for now, and guidance on negotiating the complexity of two women, were buried within the text messages. Karima even proposed covering for Darius any time he needed time with Kala, so Lena stayed in the dark. Lena was particularly affected by the treachery. Karima had always been demanding, but she had never dreamed her mother-in-law would go this far. Lena slept nowhere that same evening. Her head whirled with ideas of Darius's lies, Karima's sly influence, and the future that now seemed unreachable. She began to plot, almost automatically at first, as though her hands were moving before her mind had completely understood the consequences. A few weeks went by before Karima vanished under reported notice. Karima, in her usual austere manner, had cut off many friends and relatives, not right away. People started to wonder when she neglected to show up for a few family get-togethers. Lena, however, performed rather well. She pretended to be ignorant and even hinted that maybe Karima had gone on one of her impromptu excursions. But Karima had not gone anywhere. She was actually buried in a shallow grave in a forest close to a property Darius had acquired from a distant uncle. At first, nobody thought of foul play until a well-trained search and rescue dog smelled decomposition while its owner was crossing the forest. The hiker followed the dog's relentless pull and constant barking to look at a section of disturbed ground. Authorities were alerted right away, and within hours the truth began to fall apart. Investigating Karima's death swiftly descended into a media circus. Arriving at the scene, forensic teams verified by dental records that the dead body was Karima's. But there was no accidental death here. Trace of blood in Karima's car's rear seat, revealed by luminol spray, suggested she had been killed or injured elsewhere before her body was thrown into the forest. Detectives questioned friends and relatives as the probe dug more deeply. Darius spoke to the police looking obviously disturbed and depressed. Lena, on the other hand, was the grieving daughter-in-law, deftly hiding the storm building under her calm facade. She avoided pointing herself at every turn, cried when needed, showed incredulity at the horror of it all. Lena was quite good at lying, but the forensic data soon started pointing in an odd direction. Karima's car had her fingerprints, in an area she had no justification for having. Just days before Lena and Karima vanished, witnesses noted Lena and Karima fighting fiercely outside of a restaurant. Karima's phone records also showed something startling. She had phoned Lena several times just before her death. Those calls seemed not to be about family get-togethers or casual conversation. Additional inquiry turned up financial transactions that raised questions. Days after Karima disappeared, Lena had bought odd tarp from a hardware store and cleaning supplies. Her baseball cap and big sunglasses were visible on surveillance footage as she paid for the goods in cash, trying to hide. Lena's own feelings started to whirl while detectives developed their case. She had committed a crime she could hardly recall planning, much less killing, and now the fallout from her activities was encircling her like a noose. She felt she had been cautious enough, but she undervalued the police's exactingness. Every last bit left behind was being put together. Lena was at the center of the closing and focus investigation, but none knew exactly how far she had gone, or how severely the betrayal of Karima had cut. The detectives started to doubt not only Lena, but Darius, as well as the course of inquiry developed. Naturally a suspect, he was the husband closest to the victim, the one slated to inherit Karima's estate. Darius, meantime, had an alibi. Karima vanished from sight on the evening of a tech conference. He was out of town and had many witnesses attesting to his attendance. Still, something seemed off to the researchers. Lena, on the other hand, failed to offer a strong alibi covering the period Karima vanished from. She asserted she had been working on a new interior design project at home alone. Still, the cops kept circling back to her without any witnesses to support her narrative. Lena had always been composed and cautious, but under pressure from questioning, she started to show flaws in her front. Darius's secret life started to show itself during this stage of research. Detectives searched his digital footprint in order to not only rule him out as a suspect, but also learn about his relationship with his mother. Darius and Kala had been having an affair for almost 2 years. Thus, what they discovered was far more scandalous than they had expected. A collection of love letters, pictures, and private messages passed between them. Although the affair itself was one thing, the real shock came when the cops found Karima knew about it all along. Karima's phone records showed that she had been in constant contact with Kala, guiding her on how to remain discreet, even offering advice on how to manage Darius's guilt. Karima had been running her son's double life, keeping Lena blind and acting as the ideal mother-in-law all the while. Lena's already brittle condition broke when she found out from the detectives. She knew about the affair, but learning Karima had been involved from start would change everything. That came as the last blow. It verified for her that Karima had never really seen her as part of the family. She had always put Darius's happiness above hers. Lena had suspected this for years, but right now it was indisputable. Driven by bitterness and treachery, Lena's mental state sank. Her first shock turned into cold determination, and vivid and haunting memories of the night she killed Karima started to surface. Under the pretense of wanting to talk things through, Karima had invited Lena over, but the conversation soon turned accusing. Karima had chastised Lena, gently suggesting that Darius had wandered because she couldn't keep him happy. "Men have needs," Karima had said, her voice dripping with contempt. Lena found it intolerable at last. Her buried resentment toward this woman, the subtle manipulation, the continual undermining, all of which she had harbored, burst in a moment of pure, uncontrollable rage. Not planned, at least not deliberately. Karima was spewing venom 1 minute. Lena had grabbed a heavy lamp from the adjacent table and swung it with every last bit of force. Karima stumbled off target with the blow, falling to the ground. Lena just stared, breathing heavily, her heart racing in a moment of quiet. Still alive, Karima was weakly trying to get herself upright. But Lena found herself unable to stop. She struck repeatedly until the room fell still. Lena felt what she had done strike her like a tsunami, but time was not for regret. Her head went to survival mode. She had to eliminate the body quickly. She drove to Darius's family property, the remote one they never visited, after tarping Karima's dead body. She buried her mother-in-law under cover of darkness, praying the earth would keep her secret buried permanently. She dug a shallow grave, but neither fate nor the earth yielded cooperation. Lena's behavior became more erratic, as the search grew ever tighter around her. She was negotiating her own husband's betrayal in addition to the cops. Darius, meantime, had no idea Lena knew exactly. Unaware that she knew everything about Karima's affair and his mother's involvement, he thought she was only coping with the loss of her friend. Lena went up to him one evening. She arranged it all: the affair, the communications, the covert meetings. Darius's face came devoid of color. "For what length of time have you known?" he whispered softly. "Long enough," Lena said, her voice frigid. "And I know your mother entered on it. She was, I know, shielding you." Darius was mute. Guilt covered his face. Saying Karima was only trying to support him through a trying period, and that the affair was more about pressure he was under at work than about love. He sought to defend his behavior. Lena, though, showed no enthusiasm for his apologies. "I don't care why you did it," she said sharply. "What counts is her assisting in your lying to me. Betrayal of me." She has also vanished now. At first, Darius missed the weight of her comments. When he at last grasped, though, his eyes grew terrified. "What do you mean, gone?" Lena never wavered. "Your mother has passed away. I chopped her off." The confession felt to him like a kick to the belly. Darius staggered back, holding the table's edge for support. "You slain her?" His voice amounted to hardly a whisper. Lena went on. "You pushed me to it," before Darius could really absorb what she had just said. "Both of you did. You and your falsehoods. And today, it's all over." Darius's shock swiftly changed to fear, and he knew the web of lies they had spun was disintegrating faster than he could have ever dreamed. He knew not what to do going forward, but it wouldn't be long before the cops surrounded them both. Lena was now the only one under focus for the investigation. Soon, no more secrets would remain to cover. Shock and horror paralyzed Darius following Lena's confession. Dead was his mother, the woman who had raised him. She had always supported him, even in his worst moments, and the person responsible for her death stood right before him. His wife Lena, who he had deceived and controlled, had crossed a line he never would have imagined. "What are our next moves?" Darius murmured, his voice quivering, her icy eyes locked with his. "Darius, there is no we anymore." Her voice was eerily calm, detached even, as though the weight of what she had done no more registered. "You made sure of that when you chose your lies over this marriage." Darius wanted to flee the dream his life had become, but nowhere to go. The doorbell rang then as well. They stopped both at once. Lena turned her head slowly in the direction of the sound, and for the first time that evening, a flutter of panic swept over her. The cops were there. As Lena had feared, the inquiry had at last caught up with her. Later revealed to have come from a disgruntled former business partner of Darius's. An anonymous tip had driven detectives to probe Karima's phone records and finances more closely. They found Lena's developing animosity toward Karima and the dubious purchases she made soon after the disappearance. Faster than anyone had expected, they had made the connections. For days, the detectives had been observing Darius and Lena. Lena's erratic behavior, especially after she found out about the affair, especially raised questions about her hiding something. Now, ready to make an arrest, the couple was outside their house. Lena opened the door, her face blank, but inside she was raging with an emotional storm she could no longer control. Experienced investigator Eamon, the lead detective, fixed her a moment before speaking. Eamon said gently, "Lena, we have some questions we need to ask you." But the steel in his voice made no room for misinterpretation. "Quietly," Lena said, her hands shaking as she moved aside to let them in. She knew her time was running out. Yet strangely, she felt almost relieved. The load of the lies, the dishonesty, the murder, had become intolerable. Lena broke at hours of interrogation, at last. With an abundance of forensic evidence, blood traces in Karima's car, hardware store surveillance footage, and witness testimony putting her at the scene of the last known argument with Karima, she admitted completely. She went into great length about the murder night, how she had lost control, and how the treachery of her mother-in-law and husband had driven her over the line. Lena clearly said in her confession, though, that she had acted alone. She maintained Darius had no role in Karima's death, and that he only learned she was missing later. Already in shock from Lena's earlier confession, Darius was brought in for interrogation as well. Though he was involved in the affair and lies, there was no clear proof connecting him to the murder itself. Though in court of public opinion, he was far from innocent, the police were obliged to release him. Lena's trial attracted media attention. Headlines and tabloids found plenty of material from the affair: family strife, the terrible murder of her mother-in-law. Lena was stoic in the courtroom, hands folded in her lap. She sat as the prosecution presented its case against her. Lena was presented by the prosecutor as a jealous, vengeful woman, unable of tolerating the idea of losing control over her husband and life. Driven by the revelation of the affair and Karima's role in keeping it secret, they contended she had painstakingly planned Karima's murder. Lena's purchase of cleaning supplies and tarp was seen as premeditation. The attack, many blunt force traumas to Karima's head, was cited as proof of Lena's intense wrath. The defense tried to show Lena as a woman driven to her breaking point, though. They underlined the psychological effects Darius's treachery had caused on her, as well as Karima's manipulative influence on Lena's marriage. Lena's attorney said she had simply lost control in a moment of great emotional turmoil, not intended to kill Karima. Darius showed up daily for the trial, seated silently in the rear of the courtroom. His formerly perfect reputation was in ruins. All of it had come to light: the affair with Kala, his mother's cover-up involvement, and the poisonous network of lies he had spun around his marriage. Darius knew his life would never be the same, even though he was not under trial. He was labeled by the media as a cold, calculated adulterer, and the whispers trailed behind him everywhere. The other woman, Kala, had disappeared totally from public life, claiming she had no knowledge of any plans or violent intentions on Lena's side. She had given a quick statement to the police, but refusals to testify in court. But her name was mentioned often during the trial, since Lena's life was falling apart under influence. Following weeks of emotional testimony and forensic evidence, the jury came back with a second-degree murder-guilty decision. Lena received a life-in-prison sentence. After 25 years, she might be paroled. Lena showed feeling for the first time since the trial started, as the court remained silent while the judge sentenced. Tears flowed down her face in response to the finality of it all, not because of the sentence per such. Her life, as she had known it, was finished. Although the trial was over, everyone engaged in it still felt the effects of the tragedy permeating their life. Darius left to gather the fragments of his broken life, even though he was spared criminal charges. Once a bright startup, his company sank under the weight of the scandal. Investors withdrew and consumers turned away from the damaged brand. Darius tried to forward, but whispers and critical looks greeted him everywhere he turned. His reputation was irreparable. The house that had once promised a contented life was now chilly and vacant. Alone and plagued by memories of the mother he had lost and the woman he had betrayed, Darius discovered, knowing that his decisions had started the series of events resulting in Karima's death, he was unable to escape the guilt consuming him. Lena changed to fit her new reality, since she was serving her life sentence in a maximum security jail. Her days were a far cry from the life she had known: routine and solitude. She thought back on the decisions she had taken, the wrath she had let consume her, and the treachery that had motivated her to kill. She asked herself in her quieter times whether she could ever pardon herself. Regarding Kala, she withdrew from public view and into a quiet, anonymous life, far from the attention that had once threatened to expose her. Though she was not personally involved in Karima's murder, the affair had permanently tarnished her conscience. Her knowledge that her relationship with Darius had contributed to the tragedy would always weigh on her. Years later, the case turned into a warning story, a reminder of how betrayal and dishonesty might spiral out of control and produce unthinkable results. And while the legal system handed its sentence, the actual cost of the crime stayed in the life of those left behind, like a shadow that could never be completely disappeared. Years passed, but everyone engaged still suffered from the echoes of that fatal evening. Now, in her late 40s, Lena had come to find the monotony of prison life familiar. She stayed caught in her own personal hell, going back over the decisions that had brought her there, while the outside world moved on. Though deep down, she had already come to see that freedom was a far-off dream she might never realize. Any hope of parole was far off. Guilt drove Darius to a far-off town in order to avoid public scrutiny. His once promising career was long gone, and the man who had flourished in the tech industry now lived in quiet obscurity, laboring odd jobs to make ends meet. His name would remain always connected with scandal and treachery. Regarding Kala, she stayed a ghost, hidden from view, whose presence hardly registered. Nobody knew where she had disappeared to, or why they should find out. Though once explosive and passionate, the affair had collapsed under the weight of its own devastation. She too came away with just regret. Ultimately, Karima's murder had left not only one life destroyed, but numerous. Though the penalty had been paid, the emotional scars, weight of guilt, and permanent results of their acts persisted always. Though in its cold and merciless form justice had been met, none of them would ever be really free. Years turned into decades, and the narrative of Lena, Darius, and Karima became merely another story murmured in the darkest recesses of discourse. Though the scandal had long disappeared from the public view, those who experienced it would never be able to completely avoid its shadow. Lena had discovered a restless peace after almost 20 years behind bars. She gained reputation in jail for her silence and avoidance of interacting with the dramas of other prisoners. Having discovered the hard way that trust could be dangerous, she had no want to create fresh relationships. Rather, she buried her days in books, therapy, and long meditative walks across the prison yard. Lena's sharp edges dulled over time. Her anger softened, and in those rare flashpoints of clarity, she experienced something she had never anticipated: regret, not only for killing Karima, but for the life she had stolen from herself as well. Darius was a shadow of his former self, now a man in his 50s. Though his career had long since lost its spark, he lived alone and survived on little consulting gigs. Kala was a name he hardly thought about. He had never remarried. His life was one of routine and solitude. He had erected emotional and physical barriers around himself, as though they might drive the ghosts away. Darius could never really forget, though. He made the terrible choice to see Lena in prison on the anniversary of his mother's passing. Though he knew, deep down, that he had contributed to Karima's sad end, he had resisted for years, unable to face the woman who had snatched his mother from him. Lena was waiting in the visitor's room when he arrived, her hands folded on the chilly metal table. Her once vibrant look had faded. Her hair was gray. Lines of age and grief marinated her skin. She looked up when Darius walked in, and for a moment neither of us spoke. At last, Lena broke the quiet. "Why, Darius? Are you here?" 2 decades of silence between them weighed him as he sat down across from her. "I'm not sure," he said, his voice hardly above a whisper. "I thought I ought to see you, to comprehend." Lena nodded with hollow but calm eyes. "I had no expectation of you showing up." For hours they worked through years of guilt, shame, and regret. Once more, Lena admitted how everything had gone out of hand and how the betrayal had eaten her until only wrath remained. Darius then owned his own shortcomings: the affair, the lies, the weakness that had caused him to turn to his mother rather than face his own decisions. They were both emotionally spent at the end of the talk, but in that instant, something unanticipated occurred. A flutter of closure, a small, delicate sense that the links of their shared past were just faintly weakening. Though the suffering would never really go away, they had started the path toward knowledge. Walking away from the life Darius had destroyed, Darius knew that although forgiveness might never come, the weight of his guilt had, if only slightly, lessened. Lena experienced a change as well as she watched him go. She didn't have any fantasies that their chat would turn her life around, but for the first time in years, she felt not totally alone in her suffering. All those engaged carried the traces of the past, etched into their daily lives. But in that fleeting meeting, there was at least a glimmer of something neither of them had experienced in a very long time: closure, and maybe some peace.